Today's daf is daf Mem Dalid. We'll start here on the bottom of Mem Gimel and Beis to review what we did yesterday. Tanya, the Brisa says, 2 lines up before the end of the Amud, Hamafkir Sadehu. Now, what we're studying now is the Reisha of the Brisa. It's important that we name it because on Mem Dalid, we're going to study the Seifa of this very same Brisa. Hamafkir Sadeu Kol Shloshi Yomi. The Rabbanan made a takana that a person who's mafkir his nechasim will be granted a stay of 3 days, 72 hours, yochel achzer bo. Within that time period, he can cancel his hefker. But mikan v'yelech, after those 3 days, then ein yochel achzer bo. The mafkir could not rescind his hefker. And that applies even before someone else picked it up to be zocha in it, which would imply that we're going according to the Rabbanan. So I'm just giving a little bit of a preview of what's coming down the line, and that is that according to Rabbi Yossi, forget about shloshi yomim, toch shloshi yomim, liacher shloshi yomim. It makes no difference as long as someone was not zocha in it. Then it doesn't leave his reshus, and the hefker is not chal, and for sure he could be choser bo. And in fact, according to Rabbi Yossi, it wasn't ever hefker because it never left his reshus. And that would mean that, according to Rabbi Yossi, this reisha could not be understood because what the reisha is assuming here is eino yochel lachzer bo, that after the 3 days it is absolutely hefker, and the law is that hefker is poter min hamaser. So whether he himself, the original Bailam who was mafkir, or someone else was zoche in this, in these peros, right, or the fruits of his field after 3 days, there's a ptur maser, because immediately with the termination of those 3 days, this price establishes it becomes hefker. So it doesn't matter even if he himself is zochem na hefker, he'll be poter min hamaser because he's making a brand new kinyan on this sada, and it was poter min hamaser during the time period that it was hefker. So it would seem, again, I just emphasize the bottom line, that this brisa so far reflects the shita of the Rabbanon, because Rabbi Yossi would say even after 3 days, as long as no one else was zocha in it, then the hefker was not chal. Here it's saying that after the 3-day period, the hefker is final. And eini yochel lachzer bo, and that sets up a ptur of maaser midin hef. Now we continue to the Seifa of the Brisa, and this is today's daf on Mem Daled Amud Aleph. Omar, the mafkir declared. Now what we're about to learn is about a concept called mafkir lizman. Mafkir lizman means he puts a time limitation in his hefker. For example, he declares tei sadeh zu mufkeres liom echad. It's hefker for 1 day. Shabbos achas for 1 week. Chodesh echad for a month. Shana achas for a year. Shavua achas for an entire shemitah of 7 years. In all the above cases of mafkir lizman, as opposed to the reisha, which we had on Mem Gimel and Beis, which is mafkir li'olam, here in mafkir lizman, ad shelo zocha ba, if no one was zocha in this field, bein hu u bein acher yochel lachzer bo, which means the following, that the din is that if no one picked up this sadeh and was zocha in it, and it matters not, it says whether or not he himself, bein hu, bein acher, is yochel lachzer bo. In other words, if he's choser bo and he rescinds his hefker, then it was never hefker to begin with, because he had that period of time after which his hefker is no longer chal. So therefore, once he decides lachzer bo, to rescind the hefker, then no one else can be zoche in it. And he himself would be chayv in maaser. And the reason for this is because he did what's called a hefker lizman. So let's just make a note of it for right now, before we understand the depth of this halacha, which is going to be the development of our sugya. Then in the case of hefker lizman, then the mafkir has the rights to be choser bo. Let's give just a superficial understanding of the halacha of this brisa for the time being, and then we'll try to, shall we say, polish it up. What we're going to say is the following, that in this case that he put a time limitation in his hefker, it's not really fully hefker. It's like, shall we say, a quasi-hefker. It's a half-baked hefker. To the extent to which that if he decides that he doesn't want to be mafkir it, then he nulls and voids the entire hefker. And the implication is that he'll be chayv in maaser, because if he nullifies his hefker, then the object, in this case the sada, never left his reshus, so it was never really hefker. However, the brisa finishes by saying zachabo, and now I'm going to read it according to the Girs of Tosfos. We're going to read it as follows: Misha zachaba acher ein yochel lachzib. So that means that if before he, the mafkir, got a chance to rescind his hefker, someone else was zochebo, then the halacha is ein yochel lachzib, which means that that person was zochem in a hefker. If he himself was zoche in the hefker, then he's being zoche in a hefker. But the hefker is chal because he put a din of hefker on it, albeit for a time limit with a time limitation. But within that time limitation, it is hefker. So whether or not someone else is zoche or he's zoche, it's considered as chiyam in a hefker, which means there's a p'tur maser. So basically, the mechanics of this sugya is as following: when a person is mafker something, if it's a complete hefker and the sada left his reshus, then whether he or someone else is zoche in it, they're being zoche in a hefker. And there's that middle stage of hefker. And when you zochem in a hefker, then there's a p'tur maser. However, there are scenarios, there are situations in which it never fully became hefker. And if it never fully became hefker, then there's a chiv maser, because no one's being zoche from the hefker. And if he is zoche, then basically it was never hefker. If somebody else is zoche in it, then it's a matana, meaning he's getting it directly from the balabais, not through the medium of hefker. So the p'tur maser depends upon that middle state. There's A, B, and C. A, it was owned by Reuven. B, it's hefker. And C, Shimon is zochem in a hefker, or Reuven himself is zochem in a hefker. Matt is not. In both cases, once it reaches that level B of full-fledged hefker, it's potem in a maser. Now, if you acquire ownership on fruits and grains min a hefker, then it's potem in a maser. If he himself is zochem in a hefker, because the hefker was chal, haraya, somebody else could have been zoche in it, then he's potem in a maser. Now, in the first case, being on the brisa in the Reish Amud Aleph, there he was mafkit li'olo. He didn't put any time limitations in, but Chazal gave him 3 days stay to be choser bo. So the Gemara immediately asks the following question. Rabbi Yossi says that hefker is only chal when somebody else is zochen. That was the shita Rabbi Yochanan interpreting Rabbi Yossi. Therefore, in the light of Rabbi Yossi, then Reisha Kirabanim is Sefer Kerab Yossi. We have a problem. The Reisha certainly reflects the Shita of the Rabbanan, because it becomes hefker whether or not somebody is zochin. We gave him a 3-day period to rescind his hefker, after which it becomes hefker, and no one was zochin in it. That can't be Rabbi Yossi. That has to be the Rabbanan. But on the other hand, look at the Seifa. The Seifa, in the case of mafkir liolam, I'm sorry, in the Seifa, in the case of mafkir lizman, that would have to be Rabbi Yossi, who holds that an object that the Bailam of Mafkir doesn't leave his Rishus until someone else is Zocha. So in the case of Mafkir Lizman, the Sada doesn't leave the Rishus of the Mafkir until there's someone else is Zocha in it. As long as someone else wasn't Zocha in it, the Mafkir could be Choser Bo. And there's no time limitation necessary. It's a hefker liolam. So what we have here, l'chor, is a stira between the Reish and the Seifa. Now we're going to have a split in the Gemara between Ula and Reish Lakish. Ula is going to take the path that the entire Brisa is the Rabbanon, and he's going to have to explain and justify the Sefer. Reish Lakish is going to say that the entire Brisa is Al Liba de Rabbi Yossi, and then he's going to have to explain the Reisha. And again, let's just review. The Reisha contradicts Rabbi Yossi because the Reisha assumes that after the 3-day period, he can no longer be Choser Bo. And that's against Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi holds that until someone else is Zocha, you could be, it never left his Rishus. On the other hand, so Reish Lakish is going to have to deal with that and try to figure out how to square the Reisha with Rabbi Yossi. But on the other hand, it would seem clear that the Sefer could not jive with the Rabbanan Shita, because the Sefer basically paskins that it never left his Rishus until somebody else was Zocher Ben, in the case of Mafkir Lizman. That's against the Rabbanan. So Ula, who's going to now make this super duper attempt to interpret the entire Brisa of both Reish and Sefer Al Liba de Rabbanan, he's going to have to explain the Sefer. And Reish Lakish, as we said before, he's going to have to justify the Reish. Omar Ula. Sefer Nami Rabbanan. The entire Brisa reflects the Shita of the Rabbanan, and now I'm going to try to square the Sefer off according to the Rabbanan. Because the obvious kasha is, if it's the Rabbanan, Amai, why does it say that Ajlo Zochaba Bein Hu Bein Achi Yochel Lachzer Bo? The Hefka leaves his Rishus according to Rabbanan immediately when he was mafkir it. So why do we have to wait until someone else is Zocha in it? That certainly seems to reflect the Shita Rabbi Yossi. And now the Gemara is going to make a fundamental distinction between Mafkir Li'olam in the Reisha and Mafkir Lizman in the Sefer. Shani Lishana L'Shvua, the case of Hefker Lizman, which is the Sefer, the lo shchichi. It's not something that's common. In other words, when a person is mafkir something, he, generally speaking, he doesn't put a time limitation in it. And this kind of unusual hefker, which is what we call a shinui of lo shchich, it's not matzui, then we do what's called amidas daito. We try to evaluate his mindset. And we begin to realize that he doesn't really want to be mafkir. And that's why he added a time limitation to his hefker. I'll read to you the translation. He says, Mizeshlo hifkir es hachefetz li olam, muchach she'ein bertsono li notek legamri min hachefetz. He's not willing to step aside completely from the object. It's not a full-fledged hefker. Maybe it's just a siluk, but he's not being makne it to hefker. Al kain, therefore, gam Ein ritzonu lahotzi hachefetz b'shuso ad sheyagia li'ad hazocher, meaning here's where the Rabbanan will agree to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi's argument is that in Hefker, he never really has a full-fledged das to want to be mafkir. The person is attached to his objects. The Rabbanan never accepted that. Rabbi Yossi insists that until someone else is zocher, there's no hefker. It never leaves his rishus. He's mamish clinging on to the object. The Rabbanan will say that in one particular scenario or group of scenarios, it's Rabbi Yossi is correct. He's still holding on to the chayfetz. He added a time limitation to his hefker. The man is basically confused, if you will. He doesn't really have a full ratzon for that hefker, so it falls into a different category of hefker. The hefker that's like matana. So there are two categories of hefker. There's one category of hefker that has not only a siluk, but also aknola hefker. That's a complete hefker gomur. And about that, we have machlokus between Rabbi Yossi and the Rabban. Rabbi Yossi insists that in all cases, even in hefker liolam, his mindset is such that he doesn't want to part with the object. And therefore, it's only when somebody else is zochi gives that person a matana. The Rabbanan, on the other hand, say, well, if he was mafkir liolam, then he has a full-fledged smichus das, not only to be misalik himself from the object, but also to be makne to hefker. The Rabbanan just made a takana to give him a 72-hour period of reversal. However, even the Rabbanan will agree that if Lu Yitzur, we come up with a case in which we could be Meshayar his das, an umdana b'daito, and we evaluate that he really wasn't on board. He didn't have a complete gemiras das for hefker, and that's going to be the case of hefker lizman. In that case, even the Rabbanan agree that hefker is mitam matana. It never leaves the rishus until he gives it over to someone else. Now, let's just point out that in the Sefer, now that Ula is interpreting the Sefer according to the Rabbanan, and even the Rabbanan agreed to Rabbi Yossi that Hefker is Kematana, then we begin to understand that he's Chayv in Maaser, because it never was full-fledged Hefker. He may have had a partial Siluk, but he wasn't Mafkirit. Because he's only being mafkirid as a matana when someone else is zoch in it. If it's not real hefker, then he's chayv in mas. And for sure, if someone else is zocher, the zocher is chayv in mas because he's just simply getting a matana. He's not being zocher from hefker. And even the Rabbanan would agree in the case of mafkel isman that it's hefker vitam matana. So all this is ula, interpreting the brisa, both the Reisha and the Seifa according to the Rabban. Now we have the other extreme, Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says me the Seifa, since the simple pshat in the Seifa is Rabbi Yossi, and that is that there's a chiyuv maser because it never left his rishus, because hefker is kematona, and she is keba'acher, is Reisha nami Rabbi Yossi. Let's work out the Reisha itself according to Rabbi Yossi. But now we have a kasha. Why is it that in the Reisha, after 3 days, the hefker is out of his rishus, and it didn't reach the hands of the zocher? That's against Rabbi Yossi. And we said in the Reisha, let me just double check that he's potem in a maaseh. Am I correct? Let's go back. The daf mem gimel and beis. Yeah, potem in a maaseh. So how do we square off the Reisha with Rabbi Yossi? Reisha anu taima delolish takach toras hefker. So again, on a Doraisa level, Rabbi Yossi would insist that it's not hefker, because hefker is from atona and she is kaba'acher. So even after 3 days, if no one else was zoch in the hefker, then the mafkir would be choser bo, and it never left his rishus, and it never was hefker. But now the chachamim are worried, they're choshesh, that people will see that a mafkir could be choser bo before someone else is zocher. And they're going to say that, you know what, this is not hefker. And even if somebody is zocher bo, they're going to say he's not being zocher b'toras hefker. It's only b'toras matana. And therefore, there's a chiyuv ma'aser doraisa. Now, what's so terrible about the fact that people will misunderstand and come to the conclusion that there's a chiyuv ma'aser midoraisa because it never was hefker, if they forget Torah's hefker? So there's a double takola here. Again, the Rosh has a different shot. I'm going according to the Ran's shot, that Yomru, everybody's going to say, well, now it's chayv ma'aser on a doraisa level, and if he would be ma'aser these peros, which in truth are potem in a ma'aser, but he convinced himself that they're chayav in ma'aser, then that hafrasha would not be chal on peros that are actually chayav in ma'aser, or the reverse. Let's say he has other peros that are chayav in ma'aser, and he wants to be mafresh from those peros onto these peros when these peros are potem in a ma'aser. So the Rabbanan made a takana blocking the possibility for the mafkir to be choser bo. And then obviously it's crystal clear that the zocher is being zocher min hefker because there's no possibility of chazor. What led the people to the mistaken understanding that it's not hefker is the fact that no one was zocher in. But now what we're saying is the Rabbanan made it, and if no one is zocher in it, then the hefker is garnished and he's choser bo. But if now we're going to say that no, the Rabbanan are going to take away his legal rights to be choser bo, then everybody understands that it's real hefker, and it's potem min ma'aser midoraisa. So that's all as far as the Reish is concerned. When he was mafkir sadeu liolam in the seif, on the other, he was mafkir lizman, and that we said was lo shchiach. So therefore, we go back to the din doraisa that the mafkir could be choser bo, and he's chayiv in ma'aser. There's no hefker. Frek Gemara hachi. If that's the way we're going to interpret the brisa based on Reish Lakish, and the reason why in the Reisha, any yochel lachzer bo, after 3 days, even according to Rabbi Yossi, even though no one else was zochen and on a doraisa level, it's not hefker, is according to your logic, if the Rabbanan made this gzeira, then afilu miyom rishon nami lehevi hefker. Why do we allow him to be choser bo within the first 3 days? Even after the first day, we should have established kidei shelo tishtakach Torah's hefker that he won't be able to be choser bo. Because again, if he can be choser bo, then people are going to come to the mistaken conclusion that he's chayv ma'aser doraisa. Omar Rabba, mipnei haramoim demafkirim v'hodrin b'hom. The Ramoim are those who want to patter themselves up from Maser, to save 10% of their profits. So what do? They make some sort of facade hefker. They don't really mean it to be hefker. They don't want the hefker to be chal, even within 3 days. So they're going to be mafkir nechasav min hasofa l'chutz, just as lip service, so to speak. So they'll be potem in a mas. Afterwards, they'll be choser and zocher in the sod. So the Rabbanan made a takana that hefker will not be chal at all during that 3-day period. Now, what about after that 3-day period? Then it's not a chash. The Ramoim are not going to come 3 days down the line to be zocher in their own hefker. They'll make sure to be zocher in the hefker immediately. So now the Gemara is going to raise the following objection to Reish Lakish and his understanding that the brisa reflects the shita of Yossi. According to Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yossi, Mikar Adin, would say that he could be choser bo min hefker even after 3 days because no one else was zocha, and hefker equals matan. The Rabbanan made a takana that he cannot be choser bo after the 3-day period because of that takola that we mentioned before, when they mistakenly come to the conclusion that he's chayv and maser dorais. Well, Frekta Gemara, Avol Doraisa Lo Avi Hefker. Rabbi Yossi would say that since no one else is Zochen, it in Hefker is Kematona. Therefore, he's Chayv Masa. What does it mean he's Chayv Masa? He's Chayv Masa because the Hefker is not Chal. Because Rabbi Yossi holds it's only Chal after Zochen B'Cherem. Up until that point, he could decide that's it. I want out. So it never left his Rishus, and therefore he's Chayv Masa Doraisa. So the Gemara asks, and now we're going to turn to Mem Daled Amud Beis.